fellas. Here I am sticking my nose in again. The boys are doing an engine overhaul, and we're just getting to the bearings. I know you don't get many bearing jobs these days, so if you want to brush up a little, come on and listen in.
Well, Pat, think you'll wind up this job today?
That I do, Tom. I've honed the cylinders, ground the valves, and put in new pistons and rings. It's the bearings I'll be fitting next.
We don't get many bearing jobs in, Tom. This will give me a chance to learn more about them.
Well, Pat's the guy who can teach you.
Yes, sirree. You just stick around and watch an expert, young fella. Oh, perfect fit Pat, they called him in the old days.
Sure remember the days, Hick. Many an hour I spent scraping a bearing by hand, gluing and shimming it to make it fit. And a fine art it was.
I'm glad those days are gone. But it still ain't duck soup to put bearings in.
Oh, it ain't so tough with the precision type we got nowadays, is it?
Precision type, is it? And what about precision workmanship? Glory be, we don't have to be scraping them no more, but it's still a man's gift that counts in this trade.
Pat's right, Ed. No matter how well designed a part is, it's the skill of the mechanic who installs it that makes a good job.
Well, that's what I'm after. So I guess I'd better start asking some questions. I know bearings last longer now, but why?
'Tis the kind of material it's made out of. It's as soft on the shaft as a colleen's teeth. And besides, it picks up any bits of dirt or whatever, so they don't scratch.
A little less blarney and more facts, Pat. What about the rear main?
Sure, and a smart dad like himself knows it's a different case there.
That's right. The rear main is designed to stand up under the end thrust of the crankshaft.
I notice it's kind of shiny.
They're all shiny when they're new, but after they've been in the engine a while, some of them may turn dull.
Well, that don't hurt, does it?
No, but it might fool you that they're worn.
You know, the babbitt on here looks awful thin.
There are two good reasons for that, Ed. One is that it resists flaking. The other is that it draws heat away faster. Remember, a bearing is a friction surface.
Another thing, Ed, you can't see it, but that babbitt's thicker in the middle than at the end.
When we go to install them, you'll see how that gives better support where the load is greater.
How much undersize you using?
That's not such a good name to use, Ed.
No, it isn't. They're not actually undersized, you know. It's better to think of them as thicker walls. Besides standard, they come with 1, 2, 10, and 12 thousandths thicker walls. Remember, when you speak of a certain size thicker wall bearing, you're speaking of the complete bearing. Each half is just one half of the total size. We don't mix old and new halves on the same journal. However, we can use half of one size with a half of the next size larger bearing. This gives a wider selection to do a precision job. The various combinations are shown in the reference book.
Golly, that gives you a lot of choice.
Yes, you can handle any job with that range. Where the shaft's worn, you use combinations of a 1 or 2, depending on the amount. The 10 thousandths thicker wall is for a newly reground shaft, and the 12 is for one that's been worn since it was reground.
Then a guy's got to know all about the shaft, too.
I've been after telling you it takes a good mechanic to do any job well. Now, there are 3 steps to servicing a bearing. And the first is to listen to the sound of it. The second is to look it over, and maybe the shaft journal too. And the third is to test the clearance of it.
Well, can you tell much just by listening?
While Pat's getting ready on this, let's listen to that old job that just came in. It's going to need a complete overhaul, so maybe I can show you on it.
Oh, boy. Here's where we make like a detective.
Gosh, there's been a lot of hard miles put on this old buggy, but can you pick out that bearing knot? A rapid metallic knot like that comes from the rod bearing. Now I'll let the clutch in a little and see if we can pick up a main noise. There, hear that?
Yeah, there's a kind of pounding noise now.
This one is pretty plain. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Usually a main bearing noise is deeper and duller than a rod knock, Ed. Think you can tell them apart?
There's a little difference, all right. But this isn't going to tell us which bearing to replace.
No, probably they're all in pretty bad shape in a car that's had as hard service as this. It takes experience to be able to recognize the difference.
Then how about when only one or two bearings are bad?
Sorting the plugs will often locate them. If a rod knock quiets down or disappears when a particular cylinder is shorted out, it's the rod in that cylinder that's bad.
Does that go for mains, too?
Oh, that's a little different. Noise in a main usually fades out when you short the plugs one at a time on each side of it. Well, let's get on back to Pat.
Ah, there you are. I was about to start without you.
Well, hand me a sledgehammer and let's get going.
Ain't funny, Mickey. Hey, Pat, what you got these old ones covered up with rags for? They sick or something?
It's to keep them clean, of course, and I keep them together so I won't get them mixed up.
A clean job is darn important when you're monkeying with bearings, Ed. You even have to make sure your hands are clean. Dirt or particles of metal under an insert prevent proper seating and produces a high spot that burns out the babbitt at that point and scores the shaft. On the surface of the bearing or the shaft, dirt causes scratches and scores. In either case, dirt carelessly left in a bearing job results in failure in a hurry. That's because it gives you uneven load distribution and metal-to-metal contact.
I see. Can we run over some of the other causes of bearing failure before we start installing? Looking them over was your second point, wasn't it, Pat?
It certainly was. If you'll step over to my bench here while somebody turns the record over, there are some old bearings I have about that we can be studying. Will you look at this now? The man has been letting his oil level fall.
Yeah, there's a lot of shiny streaks on the babbitt surface.
It is a wiping action that's doing the damage here. If there's sludging or dirt in the oil pan, or if the oil is not changed often enough, the passages will be clogged up and the bearings will be starved. Always clean out the oil passages whenever you have bearing caps off. And also, if a rod bearing has failed, it's smart to make an oil leakage test with the main bearing next to it, which feeds the rod bearing.
Racing a cold engine will damage bearings too, won't it?
Sure, and a brutal thing it is. Clearance is important too. If they are too tight, they will overheat and seize. If they are too loose, there'll be low oil pressure. Somewhere I have one here. Here it is. Now, this one. Didn't have the little ear on the insert entered in the notch right, and the babbitt is wiped off.
About the only other cause would be fatigue that comes from repeated overloading and severe service. You can recognize that by the flaking of large areas.
Ah, you guys sound like a bunch of crepe hangers. Plenty of times there ain't enough wrong to hurt.
Yeah, I guess we've been telling you the worst things that could happen, Ed. This babbitt's good stuff, so you want to be able to recognize bearings that are still serviceable. It doesn't matter if they look dull or discolored. And its softness means that even if there are slight scratches, it's still good for lots of miles. The thing that counts is the amount of clearance it has.
Ah, clearance, you say. Now maybe we can be getting on with this job. We'll be fitting these bearings one at a time so we can check the fit of each one up. As I slide the upper half into the rod, I want you to notice the oil holes are registered and the ear is in place in the groove. Next, I slide the lower insert into the cap, being sure the back is clean and dry. You see how the ends stick up a bit over the cap?
Yeah, and some fellas might think the insert's too big and try to file the ends down to make 'em flush with the cap.
The saints forbid. Now, my boy, I take a bit of 1,000 brass shim stock, dip it in oil, and lay it crosswise of the bearing surface. Will you note the size of it? It is important. 1/2 by 3/4 of an inch it is, so it won't be extending beyond the edge of the bearing. And the edges of it have been filed off to keep it from digging into the babbitt or scratching the shaft. Now I'll be tightening the cap into place with a torque wrench that will force the two halves into their supports and give a snug fit all the way about.
How much torque you giving it?
It's 50 pounds on this job.
You can always find information like that in the reference book, Ed. Good idea to check it if you're not sure.
Uh-huh. But what does turning the shaft do?
With that shim in, he can tell by the feel if he's picked the right size bearing.
'Tis like fitting a pair of store-bought shoes. I pick out what I think is the size, but 'tis the feel that will tell me whether it's right.
Can you tell about what size you need?
Sure, and you can, by miking the shaft or miking the bearing insert like the reference book shows.
And when is it just right?
A steady, medium, heavy drag to it is just right, with all the other caps tightened in place.
If it's too tight, try the shaft without the shim in the cap. You're working to 1/2 thousandths clearance, so you want to be sure the shaft is free to turn. If it's a little loose, you can double-check by changing to a 1/2 thousandths shim. It's okay if you get a medium-heavy drag then. But if it's still loose, you try the next size thicker wall bearing.
You don't file the cap then?
No, we never file rod caps, Ed. It destroys the perfect circle formed by the two halves.
I see Pat's still turning the shaft.
Yes, he's also checking for out of round and taper.
I suppose by whether it burns in some places?
That's right. Another way to check out around is to mic the shaft in one position, give it a quarter turn, and mic it again.
To correct an out-around or tapered shaft, you'd have to grind it, wouldn't you? Is it much of a job?
Yes, it calls for special equipment. We send them out to a machine shop. There's a shaft up on the front bench that's just come back. Let's take a look at it.
Say, look at the polish on those journals.
Yes, and notice how the machinist was careful to maintain the fillet radius on the ends of each journal. That ensures full bearing contact and keeps the rod in line. The edges of the oil holes have been beveled, too, so they won't damage the bearings.
If you ever get one of these, Ed, be sure the thrust face hasn't been ground.
Yes, you'll get too much end play if it has. It has to be cleaned up by hand with crocus cloth.
That thrust face is pretty important if it controls end play. How do you check it?
We use a dial gauge. Pry the shaft forward and back and read the amount of movement. You can also check it with a feeler gauge between the edge of the rear bearing and the thrust face of the shaft.
Does the reference book give that clearance?
Yes, it's 3 to 7 thousandths on the job Pat's doing.
If you found more clearance than that, you'd have to replace the rear main bearing, wouldn't you?
Yes, that's right, Ed.
I guess you're finished with the rods, eh, Pat?
I am that. Now, if you'll hand me that wee little gadget there, we'll have a look at the upper halves of the main bearings.
This thing? What's it for?
That's a special tool, Ed, for removing and installing the upper halves of the main bearings.
I've seen a lot of guys try to use a screwdriver. Wreck the bearing every time, and sometimes the shaft, too. So don't try to do that, Ed.
Shame on you, Tech. Would you be insulting the lad?
Heck no. But if you were in a hurry and couldn't find that gadget, you might be tempted to use whatever's handy.
But a good mechanic wouldn't think of it, would he now? Well, I'll put this thing into the oil hole of the shaft, give it half a turn, and the bearing falls right out into my hand. Sure, and it's fresh as a daisy. So we'll just slip it back in with the help of the tool. Now I'll take a bit of shim stock and check its clearance.
Then fitting mains isn't any different than fitting rods, huh?
Not much, Ed, except that if you ever have to replace a main bearing cap, it has to be fitted, too. It comes with extra stock at the end, so you can file it to fit your particular job. Want to add anything else, Tech?
Well, maybe just a word of caution about loosening only one cap at a time.
Yes, Ed. That's just so you don't take any chance on the weight of the shaft affecting the clearance you're checking.
When I finish with the mains, I'll be cleaning the oil pump strainer, servicing the oil filter, and cleaning the carburetor air cleaner and the filler cap cleaner. And of course, I'll use new gaskets all around.
Well, I guess that just about buttons up this job. I gotta hand it to you, Pat. You old-timers sure know your stuff. And you guys listening in probably get jobs like this one. So here's hoping this little session helps you find some of the right answers. But I gotta get out of here before I've the kiss of Blarney myself.
Thank you.